Hello, everyone. Good to see so many of you here. My name is Jamie Pitts. I'm the Associate Professor of Anabaptist Studies at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and I'm also the Director of Institute of Mennonite Studies. And it's in that capacity that I'm glad to welcome you all to this, our first session of the Anabaptists Philosophy Roundtable. Kyle Gingrich-Hebert of the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center is going to be hosting this session, but I wanted to say a few words before I turn it over to Kyle about how this project developed, what we're doing here with this roundtable. When I became the director of Institute of Mennonite Studies a few years ago, I, not long after that, had a conversation with Max Kinnell, then a PhD student at McMaster University, about Anabaptists and philosophy and what kind of conversation we could organize to further explore that relationship. Not long after that, I ended up spending part of a sabbatical at the Free University of Amsterdam, where I had similar conversations with Marius van Hoogstraten, then a PhD student as well. As the pandemic unfolded and continues to unfold, and as the consequences of international in-person conferences became more apparent to us, we began to discuss what would an online kind of project look like. At the same time, I began to have similar conversations around Anabaptist and philosophy with Kyle Gingrich-Hebert of TMTC, and at a book forum on the publication of Marius's dissertation, Laura Schmidt-Roberts of the Fresno Pacific University Biblical and Religious Studies Department offered a philosophically resonant response to that book. And in the conversations that ensued from that book forum, Max, Marius, Kyle, Laura, and I decided to try to finally plan something. And this Anabaptists in Philosophy Roundtable is the result. The name Anabaptists in Philosophy Roundtable is intended to indicate the kind of scope we have for this project. We are not narrowly focused on Anabaptist theology and philosophy, though we will surely explore that relation as we go along. But we are interested in how historically Anabaptists, those who have been connected to the Anabaptist tradition, have made use of philosophy, have seen and understood philosophy in the broadest sense. This will be an occasional online roundtable. We don't have a rigid schedule, but we're aiming for 3 or 4 sessions per year. As a roundtable, we are prioritizing not only hearing from some people who have thought quite a bit about the relationships between Anabaptists and philosophy, but also having open discussion. And so we'll have some of that today. And we'd love to hear from you if you have thoughts about speakers we might invite, respondents that might be interesting to engage this question, or just thoughts about how we might organize the roundtable. We are grateful that those of us on the planning committee have all been supported by our institutions in doing this work. And so I just want to name the 5 institutions that are supporting us and supporting this project. And that's Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary and the Institute of Mennonite Studies, Toronto Mennonite Theological Center, Pandora Press, which Max has recently become the director of, the Dutch Mennonite Seminary, and the Fresno Pacific University Biblical and Religious Studies Department. So thanks to those institutions, and most of all, thanks to all of you for coming and making this happen. Kyle, over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, depending on where you're joining us from. As Jamie said, my name's Kyle Gingrich-Hebert. I'm the director of the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center. And again, echoing Jamie, I would like to welcome all of you here to this inaugural iteration of the Anabaptists and Philosophy Roundtable. So before we get things properly underway, I want to offer a few brief announcements and words of thanks. So first, please note that we are recording this event and we'll make this available online in the coming weeks for those that could not join us. Second, and perhaps this goes without saying, given the ubiquity of our use of online platforms these days, but please make sure your microphones remain muted for the duration of the event, except if you are asking a question. You can feel free to turn your video off for the paper and response if you like, though I would invite you to turn this back on for the Q&A session if possible, so that we can try as best we can to foster an engaged dialogue. So third, we will be taking questions, written questions in the chat, and you are also welcome and encouraged to ask your own questions. So please indicate your interest in doing so by using either the raise hand function at the bottom, should be under reactions, or you can let us know that you'd like to ask a question just by typing in the chat. Finally, I want to thank my colleague Becca Smoot-Entz, who all of you will have been in communication with and who is with us today, monitoring various email addresses and Zoom functions, and is available to assist with any questions you may have. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our two speakers today. Diane Enns is professor of philosophy at Ryerson University in Toronto, specializing in social and political thought, and director of the Society for Women of Ideas. She is the author of Thinking Through Loneliness, Love in the Dark, Philosophy by Another Name, The Violence of Victimhood, Speaking of Freedom, Philosophy, Politics, and the Struggle for Liberation, and she's co-editor of a collection called Thinking About Love, Essays in Contemporary Continental Philosophy. She is currently working on two research projects, the first focused on community and the second on women and power. And I think I'll just say it's personally exciting for me to have Diane with us because she was one of my teachers while I was a philosophy undergraduate at the University of Toronto. I still recall with great fondness the seminary on contemporary continental philosophy I took with her, in which I was introduced to the likes of Giorgio Agamben and Luce Irigaray for the first time. As exciting as that content was, what has stuck with me was the collaborative atmosphere that Diane managed to create that encouraged thought to flourish. And I think it is for this reason that I remember it as one of the most intellectually exhilarating courses I have ever had the privilege of being part of, and why I'm tremendously excited to have her with us here today. John Caruana is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Ryerson University. His research is in the areas of phenomenology, continental philosophy of religion, and film philosophy. In addition to publications on Adorno, Deleuze, Kierkegaard, Kristeva, and Levinas, he has published on the cinema of various filmmakers, including Bruno Dumont, Terrence Malick, and the Dardenne brothers. He is co-editor with Mark Cauchi of Imminent Frames, Post-Secular Cinema Between Malick and von Trier. He's currently working on a manuscript that examines the emergence of the phenomenon of excarnation, Charles Taylor's apt term for the disembodied modes of being that have increasingly replaced richer, more meaningful ways of being with one another, and the role that it plays in the erosion of embodied and communal social life, as well as the precipitous rise in feelings of isolation and alienation. So with those brief words of introduction, I am delighted to hand over proceedings to Diane to offer her paper entitled The Reluctant Mennonite, Reflections on an Ambiguous Inheritance. Diane, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was a marvelous introduction. I'm very touched that you even remember that course. Most students don't even remember the names of their professors when they're in the course. So I'm really touched by that. Thanks also to all the other organizers and the different partners that are involved in this for inviting me. I'm really, really honored and pleased to be here, and I look forward to our discussion afterwards. I'm going to read my paper. It's about 40 minutes. In 2010, I contributed to a volume of essays by philosophers who were asked to reflect on childhood experiences of religious indoctrination. The point was to consider how a religious upbringing affected our eventual pursuit of philosophy. With frequent references to flight, I wrote about leaving the Mennonite church in my early 20s and rejecting my faith in the Christian God, a faith that had been the unshakable core of my existence throughout my teen years. I believed this was a necessary rejection in order to escape the narrow-minded moralism and conformity of my community, with its emphasis on obedience and prohibition on thinking. It was only as a young adult, after some exposure to the world from which I had been protected, that I began to see these aspects of my religious upbringing as fundamentally at odds with the life of the mind I sought, a life of asking questions, of thinking independently and critically, a life open to the complicated world around me. At the time of writing those reflections, I was still under the illusion that we can flee our pasts with some success. I've come to realize that absolute escape is impossible. The past always shadows the present, reminding us of where we have been and what we have inherited. The circumstances into which we were born, the rough outlines of our characters, the situations and events we have little choice but to survive, constitute the hodgepodge of what is given to each of us, the good and bad, beautiful and ugly, kind and cruel. What we do with this ambiguous inheritance shapes us as much as the inheritance itself. I've spent many more years now thinking about what was given to me. In some respects, my bitter feelings have receded, mellowed with age, while in others, a certain indignation has intensified. The shape of a life only comes into view the further we are from its most important moments, and as we see it in relation to all other lives. I'm grateful for the opportunity provided by this invitation to reflect further on what it means for me to be a philosopher with a Mennonite past, and on the conclusions it leads me to make regarding the relationship between religion and philosophy more generally. I should stress this is a personal and therefore unique account of my own experience of this relationship. It may not resonate with others' accounts, but I do hope that broader implications can be drawn from what follows. I want to begin my renewed thinking about the contradictions of heritage with thinking itself, more specifically with Hannah Arendt's incisive distinction between thinking and knowing. Following Plato, she describes thinking not as a technical or theoretical exercise whose objective is to know the truth about something, but as a silent dialogue with oneself. Arendt writes that thinking is the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass or to attract attention, regardless of results and specific content. It doesn't lead to certainty, but to meaning. We think for its own sake, not as a means to an end, as is the case with knowing, which has thinking as its condition, but always moves toward the goal of establishing something with certainty. Another way of putting this, when we think about unanswerable questions. And if we couldn't do so, we would lose the capacity to ponder all the questions we can answer. Only by asking the unanswerable questions, those that give us meaning rather than certainty, do we establish ourselves as question-asking beings. Arendt insists we can all think in this sense of pondering reflection, and in fact should never leave thinking to the professional philosophers or specialists. This means thinking can never be instrumental. It should never settle, but moves in and around us like the wind, shaking and loosening. We must be vigilant against the ever-present risk that thinking will solidify concepts and doctrines that are no longer open to the provocation of further thinking. As Arendt puts it, thinking must undo every morning what it has finished the night before. It unfreezes frozen thoughts. In this work of undoing, there's no satisfying outcome. Thinking merely reminds us that all we have are perplexities, and the best we can do with them is share them with each other. This was Socrates' method. He is Arendt's exemplary thinker because he gave his life not to defend a doctrine, but for the right to go about examining the opinions of other people, thinking about them, and asking his interlocutors to do the same. Arendt's shift from truth and certainty, the darlings of philosophy, to understanding and meaning, and from reasoning to thinking, illuminates one of the most interesting contradictions of my childhood and youth. There was certainly a prohibition on thinking as a kind of skeptical interrogation of the church's teachings. Questioning our faith was considered dangerous. It meant Satan was worming his way into our souls. Socrates, who calls himself a gadfly in his role of rousing others from the sleep of thoughtlessness, would not have been welcome in the Mennonite church of the 1970s, at least not mine. At the same time, in my constant communication with an imagined other, I learned the art of pondering reflection, of the silent dialogue with oneself that Arendt calls a conversation of two in one, between me and myself. I learned to leave nothing unthought, nothing silently unspoken, even if I thought only within the narrow limits my faith afforded me. There is no way to know whether I was born with a propensity to reflect and was drawn to the daily habit of communing with God due to my Mennonite enculturation, or whether my inner conversation with God habituated a life of reflection. No doubt, it's a bit of both. I certainly identify with the temperament William James alternately calls the sick or morbid-minded soul, terms that don't convey the high value he assigns to these temperaments. The morbid-minded are unusually sensitive, reflective persons, prone to anxiety and melancholia because they are all too aware of the darkness in life. They find it impossible to ignore suffering and are often tormented by the deep feelings it evokes. But they also recognize that suffering is a fundamental part of life through which the meaning of the world is accessed. James concludes that it isn't reason that gives life meaning, but rather these deep feelings or passions, as he calls them. They are gifts to us, and the value we give to others and to the world because of these feelings are our gifts to the world. In my youth, I began to cultivate a life abundant with meaning, due not only to a strong sense of purpose, to know God's will, to please him, to be good, but also to an inner life that has no utility, no output or ultimate end. If Arendt is right, that thinking can prevent evil, this inner life is no small thing, but a condition for making moral and political judgments. How desperately we need this focus on meaningfulness now, in a world all too rapidly adapting to superficiality and thoughtlessness, since nothing is demanded of us except conformity and the endless consumption of information and products. A life without thinking is quite possible, Arendt warns. It is not merely meaningless, It is not fully alive. The unthinking are like sleepwalkers. William James's discussion of deep feelings as gifts brings me to another experience of inner life, one that has been given many different names: mystical, sublime, sacred, spiritual, transcendent, ecstatic, divine. Some of these terms are overdetermined for me. I'm unable to wrest them free from religious institutional associations, and as a result, have an almost allergic reaction to hearing them. And I'll say more about this later. Sublime captures the experience of being deeply moved by music, art, a breathtaking line, and of sheer awe at the spectacle of the natural world. In my youth, it was an out-of-body sensation that could occur during intense moments of prayer, by myself or with others, or during choir performances, when the boundaries of the self dissolved. The feeling was one of rising to the ceiling with the sound of our perfectly harmonized voices. Some would immediately recognize this as a transcendent or mystical experience of unity with God. Freud and others before him called it an oceanic feeling, a sensation of undifferentiated oneness with the universe. Freud was uneasy with the feeling, thinking it might be an expression of the death drive. But Julia Kristeva attributes his discomfort to our early dependency on mothers and the lifelong psychic impact of this dependency, an impact Freud didn't sufficiently acknowledge. When we experience the oceanic feeling, the self is lost to what surrounds and contains us, Kristeva writes, and we are momentarily returned to the security and absolute satisfaction of infancy, when there are no established borders between the unborn and the maternal body. We lose ourselves in the unremembered undifferentiation of our pre-birth condition, before the advent of the individuated self and its inevitable loneliness. Both Freud and Kristeva suggest this experience supports religious belief, a belief that Kristeva claims is necessary. She means by this that human beings need a powerful sense of unshakable certainty, sensory joy, and self-dispossession. We need to experience something more than life that perhaps commemorates the archaic experience of containment in the maternal body. I'm drawn to this description of a sublime or transcendent experience as an extraordinary sensation of unity in which the self is happily, if momentarily, lost, a sensation that is reminiscent of our original home. We might call this a silent dialogue with nature or with the universe, as essential to the expansion of an inner life as the silent dialogue with oneself. It's often said that when in nature, we experience solitude, but not loneliness, surrounded as we are by life forms to which we suddenly feel joined. The experiences I have thus far highlighted, silent reflection and conversation with God, and the sensation of sublime oneness, contributed to a meaningful life and form an essential part of my heritage. In crucial ways, these experiences have made me the philosopher I am, drawn to the most profound and often unanswerable questions of human existence. How we are to understand the nature and experience of freedom, for example, or violence, love, loneliness, and community. The outward orientation of an inner life of dialogue, an inner life of dialogue with oneself, a God or nature, has an obvious parallel in community life. I've noticed this is a theme that underlies much of my work. Perhaps my most unanswerable question is how to live together. In a collection of lectures with this essay as its title, with this question as its title, Roland Barthes suggests that what fascinates us most about other people, And what inspires the most envy is groups getting along well together, living with others harmoniously. He explores the fantastical element of living together, the fantasy of the perfect family, of perfect group togetherness. Nostalgia makes it difficult to pry apart the fantasy from the actuality of community life, a nostalgia that intensifies as we lose places and communities to which we once belonged. As Zygmunt Bauman writes, our desire turns the community into a paradise lost, inflating its mythic proportions. This is the most stubbornly ambiguous dimension of my heritage. For in a tightly bound community, we find the best and worst that human beings have to offer one another. In some, we find love and violence. The paradise we long for can become a prison, as is well known by the women of the Manitoba colony in Bolivia, where what are referred to as the ghost rapes occurred in the early 2000s. We're caught in a dilemma that appears irresolvable. We both long for the security community offers us and crave freedom from it. For the privilege of being in a community, we may lose the individual freedom to be the author of our own lives. For the privilege of autonomy, we may lose the security of living among a trusted group of people who will care for us. These desires are in tension, so we must find a way to live that fully satisfies neither, recognizing that both ideals are illusory. We are never the absolute authors of our lives, and we are never absolutely safe and secure. Some will decide a contingent security is better than a contingent independence. Others, myself included, will choose a contingent independence. Here too, we must think of meaningfulness, for it is a rare person who can conceive of a meaningful life without trust in others or the care and friendship social life provides. The intensity of Mennonite community life as I knew it in the 1970s and early 80s demonstrated an orientation toward others currently thrown into stark relief by a COVID-era distortion of freedom, now perceived as my right not to consider you. Never have we understood more the need for care and civility from others. At the same time, I have to ask who was doing most of the care work in my Mennonite community, unpaid, often unrecognized, and certainly undervalued. I could also ask who was intentionally excluded from care and trust and cast out of the fold, generally at the moment they needed that care and trust the most. Here again, Arendt has provided me with an alternative approach, which suggests that how to live together is not an unanswerable question. We can bind with others through collective action rather than through common beliefs or ethnic origins, maintain our focus on the human affairs that affect us all, and build and sustain the world we have in common. When solidarity is founded on what we are doing rather than on what we are, the borders around a community become porous, and belonging is based on a shared desire for a better future rather than a shared past. The unique experience of a rather intense collective life founded on shared historical trauma as much as ethnicity and faith has also made me the philosopher I am, still in need of vigilance against dogma and the certainty of my own opinions, wary of groupthink and terrified of ideologues. One legacy of my Mennonite heritage is thus a plenitude of meaning, a gift to one enamored with the kind of contradictions that demand relentless rethinking. But I would like to shift now to the broader implications of inheriting traditions, and with them, the institutions, norms, and beliefs we did not choose, but which, as Jacques Derrida claims, choose us. He makes this remark in a discussion of his inheritance of the Western philosophical tradition. a heritage he loves, but challenges with equal admiration and suspicion, always wary of the dangers of nostalgia. Derrida tells us that inheritance contains within it a contradictory double injunction: to leave the past behind and at the same time preserve it. In fact, he argues, it is our responsibility, as he puts it, to receive what is larger and older and more powerful and more durable than we are, but also to choose, to prefer, to sacrifice, to exclude, to let go and leave behind. He insists that the traditions we are both preserving and leaving contain the conceptual tools necessary to continually reinterpret and amend them. If philosophy at its origins is Greek, as he affirms, it is also a constant movement of liberation and universalization. Philosophy recognizes, yet surpasses its own ethnocentric or geographic limit, he says. And it does this without necessarily betraying that limit. We could draw an analogy with human rights, which have always been what Derrida calls perfectible. The idea of right embedded in the project of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights enables us to challenge the limits of our rights heritage. Those are limits well known to anyone who does not have the right to have rights, to use Arendt's astute formulation, including the women and slaves left out of our oldest rights documents, and the stateless who continue to prove the lie of so-called inalienable rights. Nevertheless, Derrida believes we can use the tools bequeathed to us by a heritage to challenge the very limits of that heritage. The point is not to kill it off. We must choose, and choose again, to keep our inheritance alive if transformed. This is simply a reiteration of my earlier point. We can't abandon or flee the past. It's a shadow we can't shake off. We neither leave the past nor stay within it in any absolute sense. Derrida might be right. We can still fight to uphold the ideal of rights and its basic condition of respect for all human life. What makes this a Herculean task is the fundamental exclusion, let's call it a trauma, at the origin of the attempt to implement this ideal. Remaining for a moment in the context of philosophy, I want to point out that it is well and good for Derrida to value the preservation of a heritage, however transformed, for he comes by his inheritance honestly. Philosophy is his birthright. He inherits it from a long line of learned men stretching back to Plato. There is no ambiguity in his titlement to this inheritance, despite his outsider status as an Algerian Sephardic Jew, or Arab Jew, as he puts it himself. If we use Arendt's formulation about the condition of rights as an analogy, we might say that Derrida has the right to have rights. He's a proper citizen of the territory that is Western philosophy. He has the right to interrogate this tradition and to wield its tools. There is no trauma at the sight of his inheritance that might make him want to abandon it. No trauma of alienation or non-belonging, let's say, of having the wrong body. Derrida speaks with supreme confidence that philosophy is Greek, albeit universalizable, audaciously suggesting that other intellectual traditions are something else. He says with as much audacity that philosophy is male in a 2005 documentary about his life and work. When asked which philosopher he would have liked to have been his mother, an admittedly insipid question, Derrida launches into a brief explanation for why his philosophical mother would actually have to be his granddaughter. First, he notes that since historically the figure of the philosopher is always a masculine figure, a philosopher is a father, not a mother. This is one of the reasons, he says, that he embarked on his project of deconstructing the tradition. transforming rather than abandoning his heritage. But this means that the woman philosopher is still to come. She can only arrive after deconstruction. She must be Derrida's inheritor, and consequently, his offspring, his own granddaughter. Derrida's response illuminates the very heart of the problem for me, related to this trauma that I've alluded to, and captured in its concluding comment. A thinking mother, it's what I both love and try to give birth to. Is this not yet another display of what Virginia Woolf calls the arrogant posture of the masculine I, that straight, dark bar, as she famously describes it in A Room of One's Own, in whose shadows we find the women? Even birth can be stolen from woman. In this instance, the philosopher brings the mother into being after her historical disavowal, a reiteration of the philosopher's appropriation of birth going back to Socrates' identification as a midwife. Derrida's is a double appropriation, for he not only plays the benevolent, life-giving mother, but gives birth to the one who gives birth. He is the mother of all thinking mothers. At the origin of philosophy, we thus find a fundamental theft. It's admirable that Derrida seeks to transform a tradition that prevented women from the right to a philosophical inheritance. But in congratulating himself on being the mother of women thinkers, he merely repeats the theft and erasure. What's more, he seems oblivious to this repetition, ironically, despite his own claim to outsider status. Why not dissemble the straight, dark bar that prevents women from being seen and heard and interrupt that line of authority? I confess I don't know if this is possible, given the belief that intellectual authority is male has lasted more than 2 millennia already. What do we abandon and what do we save? What is our responsibility to preserve from an immensely powerful canonical tradition that actively, intentionally ignored and excluded, and sometimes stole women's ideas? So powerful that still today, philosophy students may complete their degrees without ever having been required to read a woman's work. And when they do, they may not take it as seriously. De Beauvoir is merely a footnote to Sartre, Arendt to Heidegger, Stein to Husserl. What right do I have to belong to philosophy? Of course, you might protest. There are women philosophers and always have been. Though they were not recognized as philosophers in the past, we are recovering their work, incorporating it into our courses, adding them to our library shelves. Certainly, this is an exciting recent development in academic philosophy. Yet with all of these changes, we still find a universal deference to male intellectual authority and expertise. In philosophy departments everywhere, this translates into overly confident male students and insecure female students, women faculty who can't shed a stubborn inferiority complex, or what we often refer to as an imposter syndrome, and male faculty who consciously or unconsciously balk at making room for thinking women, or coming to terms with an entitlement they didn't realize they had. All of these groups have simply accepted their respective inheritances. Derrida is right to argue against killing the traditions we inherit, for they are not monolithic, homogeneous entities. We find intellectual treasures in even the most misogynist philosophers of the past. But it isn't clear how women are to choose and preserve a tradition founded on their exclusion, a tradition that continues to uphold the belief that intellectual public authority has a male face. I don't want to be the one to raise these issues. I didn't ask for this struggle. I want to live in a world in which the life of the mind is not sexed. Yet this is my philosophical inheritance. You may have anticipated where I'm going with this line of thought. The masculine lineage of philosophy is mirrored in the masculine lineage of Christianity. The power of one is the power of the other. I knew no one who challenged the authority of men in my Mennonite community, from God, the Supreme Father, to all the church fathers, to my own father. The women were not behind the pulpit, but running the Sunday school, leading the children's choirs, and cooking turkey suppers in the church kitchen. There were no women disciples. There was only Mary, the mother of Jesus, whom I describe in a previous work as mute, docile, adoring, a model of passivity. And there were the prostitutes to whom Jesus extended mercy and compassion, but who certainly had no voice, no authority, not that we heard at the time. Even the Catholic version of Mary, though revered, is not divine in her own right. As Elaine Pagels points out, if she is mother of God, she is not God the mother on an equal footing with God. Pagels goes on to remark that religious rhetoric often assumes that men form the legitimate body of the community, while women will be allowed to participate only insofar as their own identity is denied and assimilated to that of the men. We could say the same of philosophy, since reason and contemplation are forever sutured to the mind of man. Leah Melandri captures this perfectly when she says, woman is a body that simply stands next to the words of men. The Christian tradition is also being revised thanks to the work of feminist theologians and religious scholars who intervene in the often seamless gendered narrative of biblical interpretation. Had I read Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza or Rosemary Radford Ruther in my youth and sampled the heresies of the Gnostic Gospels, the effect might have been revolutionary. Exciting as these developments are, I wonder if they will be heard as anything more than a whisper in a dull roar beyond the walls of the academy. It may be, excuse me, it may be that I am too impatient in waiting for that revolutionary effect. I have alluded to an original theft, a trauma. This is the only way I have found to articulate the part of my inheritance that has caused irreparable harm. The theft of a voice, desire, autonomy, power in its positive sense of being empowered to speak and act, to rise to one's full potential. It's all very simple. Inculcate in half the population a desire to please, and the needs of the other half are always met. Teach love as sacrifice, and there is no need to love in return. Even violence will be forgiven. Suture love to the authority of fathers, the father, and all his underlings, and we become unable to distinguish between love and submission. Indeed, we learn to love those who can easily abuse their authority over us, and we may not even see it for what it is. We learn the art of deference to men, a deference that dogs us our entire lives because we have learned it so well at such an impressionable age. When they chastise, belittle, or hate us, our gods, fathers, brothers, lovers, even sons, we chastise, belittle, and hate ourselves too. This is the deep injury of an effacement justified by the lack of entitlement to an inheritance. I still feel its effects in a kind of claustrophobic reaction to certain words and phrases. Sacred, spiritual, divine, prayer, God the Father, our Lord and Savior. Or those names we hear over and over again, Plato, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Levinas, Heidegger, Derrida. I know this is not a fair or even reasonable response to terms and names that constitute rich traditions of thought or experience and are meaningful to many for this reason. But the associations are too strong for me. I hear these references to my inherited traditions and feel the walls closing in. If we want to transform our traditions without abandoning them, we must examine the psychic and emotional effects of being controlled by them. No one should have privileged access to divine authority or to the canonical authority of philosophy. It is this access, this entitlement, that renders these traditions highly effective and efficient instruments of patriarchal control. There is a bigger picture here. Beyond the personal repercussions of childhood, of my childhood, the fact is, both Western philosophy and Christianity have been instrumental in the control of women throughout their very long histories. Once we have had an ideological conditioning, are we ever the same again? Where is the line between faith and ideology? And how do we guard against crossing this line? I'm alluding to dangers that Richard Carney seeks to mitigate in his discussion of anatheism. He uses this term to describe a movement or way between a dogmatic theism and a dogmatic atheism, both of which lead to pernicious outcomes. Much like Derrida, Carney seeks to transform a tradition that is rife with the settlement of thinking into frozen concepts and doctrines. He engages in the work of leaving and preserving. A sovereign, omnipotent, dogmatic God is left behind, while an encounter with a radical other is preserved, a stranger in Carney's formulation. Alterity intervenes in any closure. Carney reveals a vital openness and hospitality to the unknown and the uncertain. He maintains we can choose whether or not to call this other or stranger God, yet ubiquitously refers to anatheism as a return to God after leaving God. The God we return to is a God of interconfessional hospitality, he says, a non-sovereign or post-dogmatic God. Carney's is an admirable deconstructive project, motivated by palpable outrage and weariness over the violent excesses of religion, its murderous potential, as he describes it, and by an optimistic belief in a different experience of faith. But the return to God after God sounds suspiciously to me like pouring old wine into new wineskins. I remain doubtful that any transformative project can be achieved if we persist in naming a divine entity. Whether male or female, the temptation to anthropomorphize is too great. As soon as we name God, or religious experience more generally, institutions spring into life, bringing with them moralism, doctrine, orthodoxy, and criteria for inclusion and exclusion. To conclude, tentatively, for I've raised more questions than answers, I wonder if it is enough to have the experiences with which I began, the silent dialogue with oneself or with nature, the stranger, if we prefer Carney's term, without naming or containing them, without calling the sublime a return to God. At most, we can admit there are dimensions to life that we can't know or understand. They are gifts of wonder. If we allowed these gifts into philosophy, we might privilege thinking over knowing and give up our relentless reinforcement of the philosopher as father. Our philosophical and religious institutions and traditions, however, provide us with somewhere to belong. In a 2007 lecture entitled "The Confession of a Reluctant Mennonite," Sandra Birdsell discusses her writing in relation to a mixed Métis and Mennonite heritage. Regardless of her insider-outsider status, She describes feeling a sense of kinship when she finds herself among Mennonites, a sense of being sheltered at the mention of those familiar names, an admiration for what she calls the mostly positive Mennonite traits that have supported her throughout a sometimes difficult, precarious, and often lonely life. Some of this resonates. I too feel grateful for learning the values of generosity, kindness, and responsibility for one's community. And the names certainly evoke kinship. But when Birdsell concludes her reflections by declaring she would gladly carry a Mennonite version of the identity card that attests to her Métis heritage, that's when we part company. Perhaps there are simply degrees of reluctance. An inheritance can't be withdrawn, and it would be impossible to abandon our traditions in any absolute definitive sense, and unwise to make the attempt. There is something to be said, however, for moving as far as one can to their peripheries. This is the only option for some of us. We look in from the edge, from a self-imposed exile. But from this vantage point, we can experience an exhilarating, if sometimes painful, liberation. Thank you very much.
First off, I would like to thank both Diane Enns and Kyle Gingerich-Hebert for inviting me to reply to Diane's paper. Diane is both a friend and a colleague of mine. As long as I've known her, I've admired her deeply reflective and personalized mode of doing philosophy and the beautiful prose that she uses to express that thought. Her impassioned style of writing is the antithesis of that mode of dry abstraction, which unfortunately remains the dominant mode of expression in our discipline. Diane's heartfelt testimony poignantly and powerfully conveys her experiences in relation to faith and religious community. Her testimony and others like it need to be heard by those of us who remain attached to our respective faith traditions. We have to be completely open to receiving the firsthand accounts of those who feel that they've been aggrieved by their religious inheritances. A religious tradition must be prepared to listen to the criticisms of both current and former insiders. These testimonies provide an intimate understanding of the weaknesses as well as the potential and real harms inherent within the tradition in question. Diane's story is all too common, unfortunately. There are sadly untold numbers of individuals across different Christian sects who have had hurtful, even traumatic experiences at the hands of their religious communities. The problem, of course, is not unique to the Mennonites. My own faith tradition, Catholicism, is, as we all know, associated with a terrible legacy of abuse and injustice, in particular towards children and women. Regrettably, the typical response has been to bury one's head in the sand at the sound of any new disclosure. Perhaps those who are in a position to take responsibility for the harms that are perpetrated in these circumstances hope that the bad press and the scathing testimonies will go away in due time. But that will not happen. Secrecy, Nietzsche taught us over a century ago, is one of the hallmarks of religious life. Historically, that secrecy may have granted various Christian communities an opportunity to evade persecution from other dominant groups. But in the course of time, that same tendency towards secrecy served as a cover for injustices and immoral practices that originated from within the community itself. Secrecy can just as easily become a breeding ground for moral evasion, the protection of abusers, and the silencing of justice. If we truly believe those words that a wise soul expressed almost 2,000 years ago, namely that the truth shall set us free, then we are obliged not only to acknowledge the positive goods that religion has made possible, but also its shameful past, that long history in which various faith communities have betrayed the core values of their own teachings. As far as Diane's witness of her personal history in relation to religion goes, then I have nothing really to add except my sympathy and solidarity. The same, I might add, applies to her witness as a woman working in philosophy. For those of us familiar with the goings on of professional philosophy, it is hard to dispute Diane's frustration with its conspicuous masculinist tendencies. That masculine imprint shows up amongst other places in the way that argumentation and logic chopping are held up as privileged modes of disciplinary presentation. It also shows up in the way that it promotes a disembodied bird's eye view of reality that Thomas Nagel famously describes as the view from nowhere. That standpoint is perhaps a reflection of a deeply embedded masculine fantasy, one that seeks to gain control and power over the perceived limitations of finite embodied affective life. As one can probably discern, I agree with much of Diane's presentation, but Diane also knows me well enough to know that our philosophical views on religion don't always overlap. In particular, I wonder about her framing of what she takes to be the dangers of religious language. Early on, in a discussion of William James's description of religious experience, Diane talks about her, quote, almost allergic reaction, end of quote, to the religious language of the, quote, mystical, sublime, sacred, spiritual, transcendent, ecstatic, and divine, end of quote. She later expands on that reaction when she articulates a reservation that she has with Richard Carney's notion of anatheism. Quote, I remain doubtful that any transformative project can be achieved if we persist in naming a divine entity, whether male or female. The temptation to anthropomorphize is too great. As soon as we name God or religious experience more generally, institutions spring into life, bringing with them moralism, doctrine, orthodoxy, and criteria for inclusion and exclusion, end of quote. I take Diane to be saying, in a nutshell, that we might be better off avoiding religious language altogether. I think it goes without saying that there's ample evidence to support a concern about the ever-present dangers that the reification of religious language poses. Though it should not surprise her if I were to remind her that Carney wholeheartedly shares that concern as well. Nevertheless, I think that this reservation, left as it is, contains a potential blind spot. Now, I do want to emphasize that I fully recognize the possibility that I may have misconstrued her actual view on this matter, but I'll take the risk of proceeding with my concern. And of course, I'll let Diane tell me afterwards if I've misunderstood her or not. The first problem that I see with the view that we ought to avoid using religious language in our philosophical articulations is that it doesn't take into account the extent to which religious meanings, whether we like it or not, are already deeply embedded within the fabric of secular political and ethical discourses. Even if we could stop talking explicitly about God and transcendence, we would not have succeeded in freeing ourselves from religious presuppositions. Thinkers as diverse as Carl Schmitt, Charles Taylor, Jacques Derrida, and Jürgen Habermas have made the persuasive case that our entire modern political and ethical landscape is shot through with theological assumptions. The second problem that I see is that these religious significations are themselves intricately woven into the very language of modern critical thinking, despite the fact that it takes itself to be mostly at odds with the religious heritage of the West. But as Hent de Vries nicely puts it, there is an undeniable minimal theology that motivates the vocabulary and philosophy of most modern and contemporary critical thinkers. More to the point, this minimal theology actually serves as the ethical kernel of this thought. This is precisely a point that Levinas makes in an essay entitled Loving the Torah More Than God. In that essay, Levinas expresses a certain amount of sympathy with those who, after the catastrophe of the Holocaust, are appalled by the continued reference to a living and merciful God. Such appeals to religiosity strike Levinas not as not only inappropriate, but actually offensive in light of the unimaginable suffering that was endured by the victims of European fascism. In that context, Levinas notes, quote, the simplest and most common response would be atheism. This is also the sanest reaction for all those for whom previously a fairly primary sort of God had dished out prizes, inflicted punishment, or pardoned sins. a God who, in his goodness, treated men like children, end of quote. That sentiment would seem to perfectly align with Diane's concern with religious language. But, and here's the critical point, Levinas immediately follows that comment with an arresting challenge that is aimed at progressive secular perspectives in general. At the same time that they are quick to renounce all references to the good or transcendence as antiquated or potentially oppressive, progressive movements continue to tacitly embrace some conception of the good, that is to say, some notion of transcendental or religious value. Of the thinker who denounces the very idea of the good as outmoded, but continues to make critical pronouncements regarding injustice and the hope for a better world, Levinas poignantly asks, quote, "But with what lesser demon or strange magician have you, therefore, filled your heaven? You who claim that it is empty, and why, under an empty sky, do you continue to hope for a good and sensible world?" End of quote. Any political or ethical movement that sees itself as advancing progressive goals presupposes for Levinas some reference to the good beyond being, that is, a religious or transcendent meaning to human life. Far from breaking with religion, secularist progressive discourses are secretly guided by a particular religious insistence regarding our obligations towards others, especially the most disadvantaged of these. Levinas's point is that the progressive intellectual ambition to fully secularize language, to reinscribe transcendence into the field of immanence, inevitably betrays its undisclosed attachments to certain religious commitments. It is important to note that for Levinas, it is not some general religious idea that is surreptitiously prescribed in the grammar of progressive critical thought. Specifically, what gets reinscribed is a messianic desire to do justice to the violence that is directed at the other. That conception of the other has undeniable roots in a particular religious legacy, one that begins with Judaism, where the other is explicitly identified with the most marginalized members of society, as understood in the ancient context of the Israelites, namely the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. Christianity extends this legacy. In its own idiom, the New Testament speaks of the other as the least of these. One can attempt to secularize this language as much as one desires, but it seems difficult, if not impossible, in my view, to completely remove the religious traces in this form of moral valuation. There is nothing obvious about the requirement to care for the least of these, especially when the least of these is not a member of my tribe. We are confronted here with a singularly religious requirement, namely the call to recognize and respect the holiness of the other. I think that it was an awareness of this point that led a dyed-in-the-wool atheist like Jean-Paul Sartre to concede, perhaps begrudgingly, late in his life, that, quote, "We are all Christians even today. The most radical disbelief is still Christian atheism." In other words, it retains, in spite of its destructive power, schemata which are guiding, and the origins of these schemata are to be sought in centuries of Christianity, of which we are the heirs, whether we like it or not, end of quote. Whether we like it or not, as Sartre testifies here, our religious heritage has profoundly shaped the modern Western imagination, along with many of its key categories. Rather than deny ourselves of that language, I think it is incumbent on all of us, believers and non-believers alike, to be cognizant, and yes, above all, vigilant too, about the persistent and perhaps inevitable role that religious assumptions and language play in our ethics, politics, and thinking in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Diane. I was getting some messages during your reply, John, that your audio was a little garbled. So I don't know if that came through for everyone or not. It was a little bit broken up on my end. But thank you for that. Thank you very much. I'm going to invite everyone, if you can, to turn your cameras back on so we can move into a time of Q&A. And so that we can see faces instead of speaking into the ether. It would be nice perhaps to, if you can, turn your cameras on. We'll take questions in the chat, so you can go ahead and type those. Or you can use the raise hand function in the reactions there below on the bottom of your screen. Maybe while you're formulating your questions, I will, maybe I'll give the first opportunity to Diane to, if you'd like to respond to John's response to you, Diane, on the question, of the dangers of religious language and the extent to which maybe you want to abandon them or not. Maybe I'll give the first opportunity to you while we try and formulate some questions.
Thanks, Kyle. I will just say really quickly, again, thanks, John, for giving such thoughtful comments about my paper. I do think that that you captured the real contradiction of inheritance. So you have beautifully illustrated precisely what is that issue? Like, what do we leave behind and what do we change? And when you say that I want to eliminate religious language, I that might be a little bit off. I think what I'm trying to do is ensure that we always rethink language, that it doesn't become so frozen that we just reiterate these concepts and ideas forever without ever challenging them. I think that for me, I will probably always have those responses to certain words, but that doesn't mean I can't find other terms. But I also just want to say that I think that you depoliticize the issue a little bit when you say that the Christian tradition is, I mean, it's embedded in our culture, and for sure, I absolutely agree with you. But also patriarchy is embedded in our culture, and capitalism, and if there's no possibility of again, not escape, but being able to rethink the framework and the structures of these things, then there's really no hope, right? So that I was a little bit concerned when you said that, thinking that when you said this about progressive people, it's liberal-minded people, we think that we can escape Christianity, but really we can't. And what else is our love of justice and the good, but religious. And that's where, and I'll stop there. That's where I think really interesting questions lie. Is I would like to think that our love of the good and love of justice is not simply about transcendence. It's not simply, it doesn't come from God. I think there's other ways that we could think this, but I'll leave it there. Thanks again.
Thanks, Diane. I don't know if you have any response to that, John. I'm not seeing any hands, and I'm learning still how to read the Zoom room. And I have most people still have their mics off, and this is the sort of look away head that you get in a classroom. I think so. Maybe I'll let you, and then we do have a hand. So sure, why don't you go, John, and then we'll go.
First of all, I really apologize about the sound issue. I wasn't aware. Can you guys hear me now? Is that clear now? Still, oh, maybe I'll change heads. I think that might help. Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. I'm really sorry about that. I think what I'll do is after I just say something in response to what Diane just said, I'm happy to post a PDF in the chat box if people want to just glance at the response. So I completely agree, Diane, with what you've just expressed. And I guess one thing that I missed initially was your comment about having an allergic reaction. You qualified it as an almost allergic reaction, right? Which is to say, I mean, that preserves, that you have a reservation, but it's not a total one. So that really came out, especially now in your response. And yes, of course, I agree that this tradition has also been patriarchal and harmful in so many ways. I guess what I tend to bulk at is the way, and I'm not saying you do this, but people who I often dialogue with who who tend to be very critical of our religious heritage, and the point I would want to make in relation to their where they're coming from is that they're not fully acknowledging the legacy and the influence that these religious traditions have had on them and have made this thing that we call critical theory possible. The ability to recognize the other as one who's been victimized is it's not part of our Greek heritage, ancient Greek heritage. It's not, you're not going to find the sources of that awareness in that tradition. It comes from a different place, different wellspring within Western culture, and there isn't enough, I think, of an acknowledgement, of an appreciation of that. So, yeah.
Thanks, John. I see two hands, so we'll go first to Bruce Hebert and then to Kim Penner. So, Bruce.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to kind of push a little bit here. I did my PhD in gender studies, looking, in fact, at Mennonite masculinity. So that gives a little bit of the background. And my conclusion was that Mennonites actually form a kind of subaltern masculinity because in relationship to dominant Western discourse, Mennonite men die for an alternative, that is for a peace position, and they have died. That is, Mennonite faith rests on the bodies of Mennonite men in a way it doesn't rest on the bodies of Mennonite women. And that actually shows up in the discourse of Mennonite women if you go back to the early 20th century. And I wrote a paper on that a number of years ago. So the question really becomes for me is, okay, the struggle is not to conflate Western discourse for me with Mennonite discourse. That's accepting Mennonites are patriarchy, yes, but that creates a model of patriarchy that I think is too homogenous and doesn't allow us to speak of an alternative form of essentially patriarchy, but that is a subaltern patriarchy. And doesn't that raise interesting additional questions? And I'm going to go one step further and say, it strikes me that if you look at the work of Gordon Kaufman, that he's reflecting this subaltern masculinity and applying it to the philosophical traditions in some really interesting ways that open up different ways of thinking theologically and philosophically that I find quite fascinating. So I just raise that isn't there a richness here that we might want to explore with some more depth?
I assume you want me to respond to that, so I will. Thanks very much, Bruce, for that. I wasn't aware of that kind of work, and I'm really happy to hear that there is complexity and depth where I didn't see it. And here I would just say a lot depends on how we were raised, what kinds of families we lived in. I lived in a very, very patriarchal family and community, and I certainly, and my experience is really quite limited to the 1970s and 80s, and I know much has changed since then. But I mean, I see your point in thinking about an alternative kind of masculinity, especially not going to war, and yes, that element is there. But in the terms of the structure of the church and family life, which obviously varies between families, I wouldn't I wouldn't myself be able to see that from my own past. So if others see that I'm great and I'm intrigued and I would love to read more about this, this idea of masculinity as subaltern. I think that was the word you used.
Yeah, subaltern. I think in particular, if you just want to look at the discourse of the Kansas Mennonites, that's what I did my dissertation on, was Kansas Mennonites and World War I, and how the voices spoke and what they experienced. And you just realize that there's something else going on. And what was really fascinating by that, and I have never been able to figure out how to untangle it, is there seems to be actually quite a strong discord between women's voices and men's voices at that time. There's an extraordinary story in the Mennonite in 1917 of the women going into the ashes of the Mennonite church and raising the American flag over the ashes as a sign of their patriotism when the church was burned down because of the conscientious objection of the men. It's this really fascinating gendered dialogue that just suggests there's so much more going on in the lives of the communities and the lives of the men and the women. And I don't even know how you tease it out. I just don't know how you get there. I'm just throwing aside. So you get Marlene App on one side arguing for the inherent and intrinsic and extreme patriarchy of the Mennonite tradition. And then you've got, what's his name? Out of Manitoba, who's arguing out of the same kinds of historical resources for a much more partnership-oriented pattern between Mennonite women that was, what is his name? Anyway, so that there are other visions of Mennonite identity found in the historical record. And it's just a complexity that I think we need to explore more, and then to see where that contributes to the way Mennonite men, particularly, or Mennonite philosophers or Mennonite women, start now contemporary reflecting some of those themes in ways we don't even recognize. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks for that. No, there are always exceptions, thankfully.
Sorry, Roy Lowen out of Manitoba. Sorry, that's the historian who argues for the partnership of men and women. There we go.
Thanks, Bruce. We'll go to Kim Penner.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. My area is theological ethics, feminist Mennonite, and I have remained very much in the tradition. I'm also a pastor, so that's interesting. I wanted to primarily just thank you for saying what is always so rewarding to have spoken out loud. This is a philosophy roundtable. There is, not surprisingly, a large number of men present. Philosophy within our theological schools continues, I think it's safe to say, to be valued as above other disciplines, considered to be the most intellectual, the most highly esteemed. And that is because of the way that the history of philosophy and what our institutions still value in terms of our education, our universities and the university and the, so I don't view it only as, today we're looking at the religious tradition, but also the patriarchy of the university is something to think about. Just responding briefly to Bruce, what you were saying, I can't let it go. I have to say yes to the different kinds of Mennonite embodiments of masculinity, but then doing a current day reflection for Mennonites in North America who have not experienced persecution, who have not been conscientious objectors, that victimhood identity has been used at times as a way to not be able to recognize one's own white male privilege, ableist privilege, etc. The understanding that we can be both oppressed and oppressor. I think that sometimes some Mennonite men avoid that by identifying only as a minority pacifist. And also yes to the fact that there have always been a variety of expressions of what it means to be Mennonite and the importance of highlighting those stories that have not been typically regarded as normative Mennonite identities. So thank you to Diane. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your comments, Kim. I'm happy to know that women can now be pastors.
Yes, thanks, Kim. And perhaps I'll just also add a note. I initially wrote to Diane with some trepidation, and I just want to acknowledge her courage actually in coming into a room of Mennonites with the paper that she did. I think that did take a tremendous courage. So thank you very much for that, Diane. We have a question that came through in the chat, and I'll go to that, and then I'll go to Simon Barrow and then Max Kennel. We're coming up to the end of our time, so I'll do the question in the chat and then those two, and then I think we'll probably need to end. So the question in the chat is from Jakob Fair. And he says, concerning the issue of religious and/or aesthetic language, Wittgenstein made the comment that we are trying to say things that can't be said. We run up against the limits of language. Wittgenstein praises those who refrain from trying to express the inexpressible, but who speak and write in such a way that the inexpressible is contained within the expressible. And so he's wondering what the two of you might make of that, how that might fit.
Well, this is probably up John's alley because he's more of a Levinas scholar than I am. To me, that sounds very Levinasian, the distinction between the saying and the said, and I think that's very true. There are things that are inexpressible, and yet we express them at the same time. Maybe all of poetry really is like that, and I think this is certainly important to what I was writing, that when I was using the term sublime to describe something that maybe can't even be captured under the sublime. But I don't know if John wants to add something to this.
No, Dan, I completely agree with what you just said, and there's nothing more that I'd like to add. And I do see that there's two other people who want to ask questions, so I want to give them time to ask.
Sure, thanks. I'll go to Simon Barrow.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. And greetings from Scotland, and also greetings from someone who's also joining a room full of Mennonites as a kind of Anabaptist camp follower in some sort of way. I'm technically Episcopalian. Both of those words may be significant. Diane, thank you so much for your paper. I don't know if it'll be able to be possible. Oh yes, I just see you've just posted a written version of it. I really, really want to go back to it because there's just so much in there. As it happens, I'm working on a book at the moment called Against the Religion of Power, and its subtitle is Telling a Different Christian Story. And the words that you've spoken have at least saved me from a number of mistakes. There'll be plenty of others in the book, I'm sure, but I really, really appreciate what you said. The questions I wanted to ask, in a sense, you can choose which you want to answer in a minute. One was that you talked about the words that you are almost allergic to, and mentioned later that you've been sort of exploring other language, and I wondered if there was something you wanted to say about that. Another thought in my mind is, your rich unpacking of Hannah Arendt and thinking against evil, but then also, are we fully alive if we're not thinking? And that whole discourse, and in a sense, the first half of what you said, I was thinking, what are the implications, or what does this mean in relation to people with mental disabilities, for example? And that opens up a whole world of questioning in that area. And my last comment come question is, again, Richard Carney, very grateful that you mentioned that book. And God after God, and can we go on naming, or will that in a sense simply perpetuate what's gone before? And I guess my question is, does it matter? I think it probably does, as to where the naming is coming from and who is doing the naming, and whether you see any sort of bridges of possibility between yourself as not wishing to engage in that naming and others who are trying to rename in the way that Richard and others have suggested. Thank you.
Sorry, Simon, I missed a little bit about what you said about RNT and people with disabilities. What was it? Were you asking about the section on thinking? That how does this?
Yeah, it was about the section on thinking, and it was this phrase that has been used about, you know, you're not fully alive if you are not thinking in a certain kind of way. And I don't want to just focus it on people with mental disabilities, but they perhaps focus for us the questions about such kind of absolute statements, really. I mean, I spend a lot of my time with people who would probably not fit into the way in which thinking is described by Harrington or even yourself. And I don't necessarily see that as a problem, although it can be a challenge. And of course, it can be a difficulty in the way that you described, you know, our conformity to a world of products and thinking for us and knowledge in a masculinist sense and so on.
Okay. Well, I'll probably be giving very dissatisfying responses here because I'm really not sure about any of your questions. I in terms of the RN question, I think you're right. It shows that, I mean, we could talk about people with disabilities who don't have the cognitive capacity, although we have to remember that thinking for RN is that kind of reflective pondering. It's not something very technical, right? So there's that, but of course there are people who couldn't even do that, and I think, you know, it wasn't something on her radar, wasn't something she was thinking about, and so when she was suggesting that people who aren't thinking are not really alive, she's thinking about Adolf Eichmann, for example, and other Nazis who were not thinking when they were contributing to the final solution. So there's that. The other thing I wanted to say about words and about, I haven't actually thought, I mean, when I was writing this, I was speaking with a friend of mine who I think is here still, who is a Quaker. And he was telling me about the silence of the Quaker life, the silence of when they get together for their services. I'm not sure what they're called. And this really intrigued me because I think, can't we have a sense of, let's use the term spiritual, can't we have a sense of spiritual, of spiritual life, of a really deep inner life that isn't focused on particular words? And I mean, I guess my biggest struggle is with the term God. And I just can't really imagine how we would be able to unthink the maleness of God. And I'm sure there are lots of feminist theologians doing this. I'm just not really aware of what's been happening lately. But in terms of other terms, no. I mean, I said an almost allergic response, but I would say it is allergic. And this is because of, because of the context of my childhood and needing to extricate myself from it. But in terms of, I mean, I'm perfectly happy for other people to use these terms if they want them and if they're meaningful to them. So I haven't really thought about that other than the term I used, the sublime, because I love this term, but other terms I haven't thought of. And I think there was another point you made, but I've forgotten it now. Was it about Carney?
Yeah, it was more about whether there might be about who is the importance of who is doing whatever naming is going on, and trying to think in a communal rather than an individual sense.
Yes, I think that's a very, very good point, because who is doing the naming? I mean, that's philosophy, whether we think of philosophy or religion. It's generally been men who determine the route that religion takes, the route that philosophy takes, and so the naming is being done by men. I don't know if a particular religious community wanted to get together and just decide on all the different words they want to use. Maybe that would be a clever way of going about this. Thank you, Simon, very much.
Thanks, Diane. We'll take one more question. Max has ceded his question to Fulco Van Hulst, so I'll turn it over to you, Fulco, and this will be the last one. We'll wrap up after this.
Thank you. Well, speaking from a Dutch European context, well, personally, I was raised, well, I would not say totally feminist, but in a totally different context. So in our Dutch context, female pastors are quite normal, and so this is not really the question I want to address. It's a question that puzzles me, and it has been puzzling me actually over the last few years already, but it connects really to our discussion today, I think, is whether the lack of a female perspective in our Mennonite theology, let's say of the last 50 years, might have been one of the key, well, how should I formulate it? Might have led to what we might call nowadays the Yoder Gate. Didn't we lack a perspective that could have helped could have helped us towards a different way of doing theology, because the theology of the theologian that I will not mention anymore now was all about power, but it was never about power relations between men and women. I said already to Kyle, I might open a whole new discussion with my question, but.
Well, I think you're right, and I think this is the big question: is how do we take the power out of religion? And I'm talking again of the politicization of religion. Can we detach these? And I'm not sure we can. It's like saying, can we take the politics out of patriarchy? Because at some essential level, if religions are primarily determined by men, if all the terms are invented by men, if all of the entire framework and structure of a particular religion is male based, then how do we depoliticize that? I don't know how, and that's why I express quite a bit of skepticism here that if a religion is based on a male god, it's impossible to do that. But I'm sure there are counter arguments, and I'll have to look them up to see, because I find that just too difficult. So you're right to ask. I mean, it's a very good question. How do we depoliticize religion?
Well, thank you
Thanks.
very much, Diane and John. Would you all join me in expressing our collective thanks for Diane's paper and John's response? This has been a really wonderful time together. We're so grateful that you could both join us. Just to reiterate that we will record this, and it will be online somewhere. We'll let you all know where it will be whenever it gets there. And just to whet your appetite for the next one of these, we do have a date, Wednesday, April 27th, again at the same time. Max Kennel, who is here today, will be presenting a paper entitled Anabaptism Contra Philosophy on Violence, Enmity, and Interdisciplinarity. So more details will be coming out about that. So you can stay tuned and watch for that announcement. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and spending a little bit of your time with us today. And good wishes for the rest of your day or evening or morning, wherever you happen to be. Thanks again for being with us.
And thanks to everyone and for your comments and questions.